Laura, it's nice to meet you. I'm
Very
Kyle.
nice to meet you.
Oh, I forget you haven't met. Yes, sorry.
No, we
Right.
haven't met. Yeah.
No, I
I'm
I
a
do
terrible host.
I do the I do the digital stuff for Doug now, so I get to do this fun podcast with him. It's basically, just a discussion. And, right now, generally before I do the intro, we talk about sports, but we won't do that today because neither of us are happy about our sports teams. So I'll just go ahead
You
and
don't
do
want to
the
talk about Taylor Swift?
No, I
I'm happy
don't.
to talk about Taylor Swift.
I mean, she's still not talking about tax reform, right? Like that.
and she's doing nothing for the National Flood Insurance
I was-
Program. I mean, she has
Yeah.
failed on every important policy issue. I just don't understand it. I don't understand the adulation for someone who has manifestly no accomplishments. I mean, it's unbelievable.
Well, she does have an accomplishment in that she's finally the NFL found a new way to attract a bigger audience. I didn't think it was previously possible to get a bigger audience for the Super Bowl, but here we are.
Well, okay. So there, we talked about Taylor Swift.
There we
Yeah,
go.
we did. Yeah.
All right, let's do the intro.
So are you recording?
I am recording. Yeah, I started
Okay.
it when she came on.
Good. Okay.
All right. On this episode of the AAF Exchange, a deep dive into the problems of and solutions to the U.S. immigration crisis. Joining us, as usual, is Douglas Holtz-Eakin, as well as a special guest, Laura Collins, who is a director of the Bush Institute-SMU Economic Growth Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute in Dallas, Texas. Thank you both for joining us.
I'm delighted to be here, Kyle, but how come she gets a 5-minute title and I didn't get a title at all?
Doug, our
You
audience
can
is...
take that up with my superiors. It's not something I decided.
Doug, I think our audience is tired of hearing your title. They hear from you. They hear that every couple of weeks. So, Laura, thank you again for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You have a particularly broad perspective on immigration challenges, both from your professional work with the Bush Institute there in Texas, and a local perspective on all this. And of course, immigration is one of the most urgent and contentious issues lawmakers face, both at the federal and state levels. We know that it's going to be a central point of the campaign season. The Senate appears close to releasing some sort of a draft reform, close being in air quotes.
Close in political terms.
Yeah. So certainly we want to talk about all this. But first, this debate carries a lot of charged opinions. So let's try to cut through some of that noise. Start by walking us through the basics of this debate first, and then let's talk about, what each side is arguing.
Sure. So just to start, I really think that a level set of my perspective is important. And, at the Bush Institute, we really believe America benefits from immigration. And so, while we're nonpartisan, we have that perspective and we think that's important. We need an immigration system, however, that meets the needs of our 21st century economy and ensures the future prosperity and vitality and security of the nation. That's just not something we have right now. And part of the reason that this debate is always so contentious is that there's a lot of moving parts to this. We often think of it as just domestic policy, but it really is foreign policy as well. We rely so much on our neighbors and our allies in terms of things like deportation and security. So there's a lot of things that have to go into any agreement on this. And when you start to slice and dice who believes what and what's supportive, broadly speaking, you can put them in two camps. Generally pro-immigration, generally anti-immigration. And within each of those groups, you can go even deeper. So you have people who really believe the economics of the issue are important, like Doug, like myself. You have people who think that the humanitarian piece matters a lot more, that it really doesn't matter what your skills and education are if America's a refuge and we should be welcoming folks. And on the generally anti-side, you end up with a few different scenarios. Mostly you have people who say, well, I like enforcement. I think we need to do enforcement first. I'm really scared of who's coming across the border. But legal immigration is great. We know who those people are. We vet them. They followed the rules. They stayed in line. Increasingly, what we're seeing instead is this sort of populist economics of like immigrants are bad and they take our jobs, which we know from the economic data isn't true, mixed with an enforcement only perspective. If we're just mean enough, if we just enforce the laws enough, that we actually will get to zero at the border, which is completely unrealistic. We wouldn't ask that of any other law enforcement agency. And I think doesn't take into account the very human aspects of migration. These are individual human beings making a decision based on their personal circumstances choices about what's going to be best for them and their families. And as much as we would like everybody to respect the rules on that, if you're talking about the difference between being able to feed and support and educate your family or not, you're probably going to be on the move. So we can pass all the harsh laws we want. Ultimately, people are still going to come to our border.
Yeah, I mean, Doug, we talk a lot. I mean, we've
Yep.
talked a lot about the economics of all of this, but I mean, it's interesting to hear, that there's a lot other perspectives. I mean,
I think it's not well understood that what Laura said is absolutely dead on the money. People are going to come to our border.
yeah.
So like there was this sort of great surprise to me, and I like to think I follow these issues, but CBO put out this report on the demographic outlook from now to 2054, and that's all about America's low fertility and its mortality, and as a result, the fact that the native-born population is not going to provide any population growth. It's going to all be immigration. So that story you and I have talked about, we've told that, but I looked at the numbers and like there's this huge spike in immigrants in the US in the past 2 years, an additional 2 million more. The number of people coming across the border is staggering. It is incredibly high, and wrapping your head around the magnitudes, I think, is important. So this is a big issue, and the composition has changed dramatically. It used to be that it was people coming from Mexico, and then it was people coming from Central South America through Mexico. Now there are 25,000 Russians, 25,000 Chinese. People are going to come to the U.S. There are global reasons for people to decide to come to the U.S. So we better figure out how we want to handle this.
Yeah,
Okay,
and
so-
I think a lot of those people, I'm sorry, but
No,
a lot
go
of those
ahead.
people are coming to the border because they don't have another legal pathway, right?
Right.
And so part of this is also understanding the broader geopolitical issues here. If you are a Nicaragua, which we know has happened, you can say, hey, how do I cause some chaos here? And that for a while was you didn't have to have a visa if you were from certain African countries to fly into Nicaragua. So of course, those people, if they have enough disposable income, they're going to find a way to do that. They're going to fly to Nicaragua, and then they're going to go on foot through Honduras and Guatemala and El Salvador to come through Mexico to try to get to the United States to request asylum. Because what other options do they have? Europe doesn't want to take them.
Right.
They have skills and abilities. There's a large youth population in Africa, right? And not a lot of opportunity. So if that's who you are and you find an opening, you're going to take it. And so that's just one example of the issues that we see when we look at the broader hemisphere as to how people are getting here.
So again, Kyle, to turn into the economist on you, I'm sure this is not on the script, but I have felt for a long time that the following is true. I'm old, so we know that like in the late 90s, when I was first starting in this part of the world, looking at immigration, the basic notion among economists was, look, Western countries have all the capital, and all of the population growth is going to be in Africa, Central Asia, former Soviet republics, Middle East. And so how does economics work? Well, the capital will flow to the labor. You combine labor and capital, you produce stuff, repeat. I mean, that's all economics is. And it didn't happen. For whatever reason, the capital never really went there. Bad contracts, corruption, go through the list. But economics hates a vacuum. So the labor is coming for the capital. And so the powerful forces to get on a plane, get to Nicaragua, get to the US are real. And so we ought to just recognize that and figure out how to build a legal immigration system that accommodates what our needs in that world. And as a result, gives you some chance of being successful at the border.
And in some ways, we were successful in getting that capital there, right? In that we've broadly eliminated most of the worst global poverty.
Yeah.
And the poorest of the poor don't migrate because they can't afford to. So it's not, I don't consider it a bad thing that people are not living so poorly that they can't migrate, but it does mean that we need to take a real look at the systems we have in place and decide to modernize them to meet what the new realities are instead of the situation in the 80s and 90s, which doesn't exist today.
Interesting. All right. Well, let's take a deeper dive into all of this. Not that we've already haven't been taking that deeper dive, but let's just look at the situation on the southern border, because I think that's where a lot of the conversation is right now. What are the key drivers of that crisis?
Oh my goodness. Well, a lot of it is that we have a lot of open jobs in the United States, and people think that if they get here, they can have an opportunity to make enough money to support themselves and their families back home. So that's number one, right? We know that a strong economy in the United States is always a pull factor. It doesn't matter how much we crack down on employers, doesn't matter how much we crack down at the border. People are going to want to come here to work because they know that they're going to make so much more money than they would at home. So that's the biggest thing. And then you have a lot of, this isn't just a Western Hemisphere problem. We see global displacement all across the globe, really, really high levels. Some of it is about conflict. Obviously, there's lots of conflict zones right now, but a lot of it is also corruption and kleptocracy. We see this a lot in Latin America. You look at Venezuela, for example, and, in Venezuela, yeah, there's some political persecution. I don't want to underplay that at all, but a lot of the people who are leaving Venezuela just are tired of standing in line for hours trying to get basic groceries. They're tired of not having medical care. That's a country that's really done its level best to steal as much as it can from its citizens. So those people are going to be on the move because they're looking around going, I don't want to do this anymore. Like, my kids are suffering, my family's suffering. I'm going to go find a place. And we also saw in the last couple of years, large groups of Haitians coming to the border. A lot of those folks actually weren't in Haiti. They had been in South America. They left a decade before because the situation in Haiti is always volatile and always poor. And then what was working for them in South America no longer was working. The governments that were hosting them didn't want them anymore. So they started to go on the move. And because we have an asylum system, a lot of them, even if they're economic migrants, are coming to request asylum. It's their only legal pathway here. They also know that system's so backlogged that it's going to take several years for their case to process. In the meantime, they're going to be able to work legally. After about 6 months, they get a work permit. And so they make a really rational decision. If I can make it here, and I'm probably going to get to stay for at least a few years and work, and then we'll see what happens. You also have social media in the mix. We've seen increasingly, it's not, because people are on the move, the human smuggling networks are very sophisticated, very entrepreneurial. Lots of businesses have sprung up to help funnel people to the border. And then they use social media really smartly, and that they pay people to go to Times Square if they get to New York and say, look at the money I've made. And some people are just doing that voluntarily because they want to brag, right? It's social media. Those things, I think, are big game changers. A lot of folks have smartphones. A lot of folks are on TikTok. They can see what's happening, and they don't know the reality of how hard it is to get here.
Right.
They're not seeing that you might be living 15 people to an apartment because you can't afford rent, but they see that there's an opportunity and they're going to take that.
Right. Yeah, I never thought about that. The communication aspect of that, being able to see, TikTok, Instagram, social media, etc. Just being able to see all of the good stuff and be like, oh, I want to be a part of that.
Yeah,
there has been sorry, go ahead, Laura.
Oh, I was going to say, there's actually influencers that are starting to walk the Darien Gap through Panama, which is the really dangerous part.
Wow.
And filming it and showing in some respects are showing the reality, right? That it's very dangerous, it's very hard. In other respects, they're going, hey, I made it through. You can make it through too. And so it's an extra dynamic that's really, really hard to fix or prevent or change.
Again, for perspective, we had immigration waves under many presidents. We have one under Biden. Trump had one. Obama had one. George W. Bush had one. I mean, this is not a new phenomenon, but the scale is really exacerbated by the social media. The communication aspect is enormous.
So what are the key components necessary to fix this solution there? To what extent, do you think the Senate reform legislation that's sort of making its way through the process behind closed doors is likely to move that needle at all?
Obviously, it's hard to tell what's in the Senate package. It's been very much kept a lid on. We don't really know what's in it. I will say this, when I think about what works on border policy, it's about how do we funnel people to ports of entry? How do we find other places for people to resettle? And how do we get people into other legal pathways? Anything that's just simply going to be, well, we're going to tell more people no when they get to the border, it's not going to work, right? So if you're talking about a system that funnels people to ports of entry and is able to process them quickly, that's really key too. If people are able to languish in the system for 6 or 7 years, there's no real incentive not to come to the border, right? Because you're probably going to get in, you're probably going to be able to stay. And then this other legal pathways piece is just really, really important. The United States needs labor. There are lots of people who've been waiting in long lines, some 10, 20 years. Our legal immigration system is just inadequate for the needs of today. And then you have to also consider that, some of this is things Congress should do, right? Like changing legal immigration to make it more expansive, more legal pathways. And they can do some stuff on the border too, in terms of changing what the asylum law says right now. There's no difference between whether you come at a port of entry or between a port of entry. If they wanted to toughen between ports of entry, try to funnel people to ports of entry and other legal pathways, that would make some sense, while also not leaving out in the cold the people who really do need to cross between a port of entry. Like if you are in true danger, that's what asylum is designed to do, right? Be able to cross wherever you are so that you can reach safety. But some of this is also, what are we doing diplomatically? What other countries are we going to be talking to say, hey, I know you need labor too. There's this group of workers. They're on the move. What is it that, how do we help you set up an immigration system that allows you to be a receiving country, that allows you to successfully integrate them? And that's something that I think is harder to pin down, but also really, really important when we think about global migration trends. It's not just about who can we take in, it's about how do we help the rest of the world and our allies and countries who could be receiving countries really have a system that works as well.
And there's some fairly mundane things like money.
Yes.
I wrote about this earlier this week. I mean, I don't think most people know that the U.S. Customs and Immigration Service is a fee-funded agency. Congress doesn't appropriate money every year. It has fees. The immigrants get charged fees. There are fees for H-1Bs. There are fees for all these different services they provide. And the fees are supposed to cover the cost of the service. That's how they're supposed to be set up. And the fees hadn't been changed since 2016. And we have this massive influx and backlogs. And, at some point, they might need more money. So they just raised the fees for the first time. That's fine. But honestly, if you have a major national priority that you can actually solve with a couple $1 billion, you got to think about just spending more money. I mean, spend more money. Well, I'm the conservative, and I'm saying sometimes you just got to take care of the problem.
That's what I find really funny about the border discussion too, is that, so often it becomes like, well, we need more detention beds and we crack down. And detention's expensive.
Yeah.
Alternatives to detention are less expensive. And we know that if we do them successfully, we have the ability to make sure people are showing up for their appointments and their hearings. Obviously, the deportation aspect is a little different. Years down the road, it's harder to deport people. But, the least expensive thing we can do is probably to create new legal pathways and give people work permits, right? And so there's a little bit of this where you go, okay, if you're really concerned about how much it costs, you're not willing to give the agencies the money, what is the other solution you can do that's mutually beneficial? And, I'd also add that because USCIS is fee funded, when you have a sharp reduction in legal immigration, which we saw a little bit because of policies in the last administration and a lot because of COVID restrictions, that agency loses a ton of money quickly. They have to lay off staff. They have to get rid of contractors. And then it takes a while to staff back up. And so that agency's been digging out of a hole for a couple of years now.
True.
Interesting. Well, this is usually the part of the podcast where I ask Doug a really tough trivia question, but I skipped it this week. So I don't have anything for you this week, Doug. I'm sorry. It's just because we have so much to get to, and I just didn't think we'd.
Well, and I got us off of the schedule. I'm sure I've,
No, but I mean,
you probably had like 6 more questions, and
this is where I get to act like I'm smarter than Doug for once, and so it's usually just a feel good section for me. So it's more on me.
Embarrassment for me. I'm really shocked we're skipping this.
So let's switch gears and talk about the undocumented immigrants who are already here. We obviously are focused on the border because of the current wave, but this comes up every election cycle, it seems like, in my lifetime at least. I'm sure in Doug, your lifetime, you've seen it just as much. What are the key what are the key challenges? And what are some potential solutions around this issue?
Yeah, the undocumented, a lot of them arrived legally and overstayed a visa. Other people have crossed the border. I think you could also probably lump in, not to the larger undocumented number, but you could broaden that number and talk about people who just came irregularly, who have an irregular status, right? Maybe you're waiting for asylum, but you have a legal presence because we're waiting for that to play through. Maybe you're on TPS, so you have no temporary protected status. So you have no real way to become a green card holder and an eventual citizen, but you're here, you're allowed to stay, you check in with authorities. So you have this big group of folks, and what are you going to do with them? They're here, they're working. Some of them are business owners. A lot of them are homeowners at this point, and a lot of them have American citizen children. Even when we talk about the dreamers, the population of folks who were brought here as children, those folks are my age, right? They're in their 30s and 40s. A lot of them have American citizen children. They've grown up here. And so the question always comes down to, on policy, is it realistic to try to deport these people, especially dreamers who don't really know anything but the United States? They're Americans. Their passports don't say that, but they are. Or do we find a way to help them regularize that status? And if you look at the policies and the legislation that have come out multiple times over the last decade plus, the steps tend to be pretty similar. Pay a fine and a fee because you've been here illegally, pay your back taxes, submit to an English test, submit to a background check, make sure that you've done all the things that we deem necessary to show that you respect the fact that you did not follow the rules here. Ultimately, we're talking about a large percentage of our workforce. It's like something like 11 million people and 6% of the workforce, right, Doug? I mean, I haven't looked at those numbers in a while. It'd be extremely expensive in terms of actual taxpayer dollars to detain and deport all of them. And that's before we have this other backlog in asylum, right? Last time that I really looked at this was 7 or 8 years ago. And that point, we didn't have this big asylum crisis. So we weren't talking about also running people through the court system that was overburdened in another way. So it'd be even more expensive and take more time today. And it's something like $1 trillion in GDP. Why would we shoot ourselves in the foot here? It makes more sense as a society to find a way to assimilate and integrate these folks, give them a regularized status. And yeah, if people are not following the laws here, and they're a criminal and they're a danger to our public safety, that's a separate question, right? That's an easy call. Those people don't need to be here. But most of these people are law-abiding. Most of them haven't done anything other than just try to support their families. So finding a way as a matter of policy to get them regularized in society, I think is a win.
This becomes, one of these very common situations where you can sit down and figure out the policies. We can identify different categories. We can figure out the hoops through which we'd like everyone to jump and the paperwork they need to follow, all that. It's the politics of this. And the politics boil down in many cases to simply, we're going to call anything short of deportation amnesty because we have forgiven you for past transgression, even if there's a penalty and a fine. So, if you get a speeding ticket and pay the fine and go on, that's amnesty by another name in this world. So, and that's really just the anti-immigrant sentiment that is there and is part of the debate, hiding behind amnesty. And it's been a powerful argument because they point back to one of the great presidents of the 20th century, Ronald Reagan, say, look, big mistake. Reagan did it. You're no Reagan and you're gonna make that mistake too. Oh my God, when your legacy is gonna be terrible. So the politics of this have really been the stopping point. It's not about the substance. And B, it's never been important enough to overcome those politics. I think that's the difference now. It's that population, especially with the huge influx of people waiting for adjudication of their requests for asylum, right? That population is getting really big quickly, needs to be settled somehow, and the labor needs have become quite acute. And people are starting to understand that.
Yeah, I think it's also really important, though, when we talk about that Reagan bill, the 1986 IRCA, everyone points back to that as like some big mistake and like, look at how the undocumented population has grown. And this was a mistake because it made people want to come here because they knew if they just waited it out. And the data doesn't actually support that.
No.
And it doesn't. And where you really see the growth in the undocumented population is 1996 and beyond, because that is when we had the big border crackdown. We built miles and miles of wall. We took away benefits. We made it too expensive for the workers who were coming across the border and going back home, too dangerous and too expensive for them to do that. And so now we have this large undocumented population because why go home and risk not being able to come back and support your family? So you're going to stay here. You're going to find a way to bring them here eventually. And so it wasn't 1986. Like, that upsets people a lot, but the facts are not on their side here. They keep pointing to it. It feels good. It feels right, but they're really, really wrong.
Which is another way of just emphasizing a point Laura made earlier, which is if we had a legal temporary workers program,
That's
you
bigger than
wouldn't
the one
that
that
then
it
you
is,
wouldn't
right?
then you wouldn't have this illegal crossing problem in the same
Yeah.
dimension. So the solution has to involve all the pieces. You got to
Yeah.
take care of it.
Yeah, I mean, one of the ones that always, I mean, the politics of this seem, that's where it's driving all the impediment to solution here. And another category, which Laura, you mentioned, was the dreamers. They're, of course, involved in all this. I mean, most of them have been here since they were, before they could walk and talk. So how did and this really under the DACA program, which came in under Obama. So how did those recipients fit into this conversation?
Oh, well, I feel like it's kind of sad right now in that, before, I used to always tell folks that, for 20 years plus, we've had bipartisan legislation that has never been able to get it past Congress, but most presidents would have signed it. I don't actually see a big push on Dreamers legislatively right now. It's
No.
really sad. Broadly, there is broad public support to doing something for them. We've had kind of a newer political movement around what's the documented dreamers, which is a newer problem because we have kids who came here legally. They're still on their parents' visas. They're either stuck in a green card backlog or their parents are on a visa that can renew in perpetuity, but does not allow them to convert to a green card. So those folks age out of the system and they have to then go home back to their country of origin. So we've got a big group of folks, broad public sympathy, broad public support for fixing the issues that they're victims of a broken immigration system. And they really have gotten lost in the debate in the last few years. There's just not a lot of momentum. It's a little ridiculous. It's a fairly small number of people. They are obviously, as you said, most of them have been here since before they could walk and talk, and they're culturally American. I mean, we don't even have to do any of the work to integrate or assimilate them, right? That's already happened. We've educated them. They've paid tuition at our public universities. And there's not been a lot of political will to do anything for them.
So I think, Kyle, in the bigger picture, the politics, have cut it in two ways that we've seen before. Number one, if there's bipartisan support for something, it becomes a hostage. And the Dreamers, everyone held them hostage to the additional thing they wanted to get done. And so the Dreamers never got done. And that's a real shame, period. It's not deeper than that. And right now we are sadly, I think, in one of these moments where people are more interested in having immigration as an issue, the border's an issue, than getting a solution and getting rid of the issue, because we're heading into the election. They want to have some finger pointing, your fault. That is very typical in American politics, but it's not going to generate any long run solution on some very important fronts: humanitarian, economic, and other.
I will say, though, for the senators working on this, I believe they are sincerely trying to find a solution.
No
and
question.
I think that given the volatility of this topic in a presidential election year, like for them to decide to put their careers on the line for this is, I think, we should 100% support that, even if I'm a little worried about what's going to come out and how much of it I'm going to support as a matter of policy. We'll see what the plan looks like. But, I do think that is so valuable that they're willing to work on something so difficult when everyone around them is saying it's never going to pass. We don't want it anyway. And I want all or nothing. I only want my solution and nothing else and no compromise. And so those senators are doing really, really good work. We'll see what the final product looks like, but we should all support more of that type of activity.
It's the my bill is great, so but your bill doesn't do anything my bill does, so we can't agree to bring them together. The classic politics around this.
On immigration, sometimes the bills match 90%, but it's that 10% where they don't want to do it. And we see that a lot. I mean, even within caucuses, folks won't support a bill that their fellow senator has on the same side of the aisle because it's not exactly how they wanted it written. Mm-hmm. And it's really, really sad.
Yes.
It's all sunshine and rainbows when we talk about immigration. It's so positive.
Yeah. So anyways, on that note, I think it's clear to everybody in this conversation, at least, that our immigration system is in desperate need of an overhaul. Laura, you've written extensively about this. Doug, several years ago, you proposed moving from a from the family reunification to a merit-based point system. It was that whole Concord thing you and I believe Jackie Veras at the time did.
Yep.
To each of you, what should be the primary focus and goals of a successful immigration reform?
I'll go first and go quickly. You got to check all the boxes. You got to check border security. You got to check dealing with those here illegally already, and you have to reorient the visa system toward meeting the needs of the nation. And I believe deeply it should have more economic content, not exclusively. I mean, our history of sheltering refugees and those seeking asylum is a rich and glorious one. It's an important part of who we are. But we also are a nation that needs a more rapidly growing labor force that has the skills for the 21st century. This is a piece to that puzzle. So that's why I went toward looking for those skills in the merit-based system. That's not unique. There are lots of proposals out there. I could probably support any of a dozen of them. Let's just get to the point where we're trying to take a vote. That's my hope.
Yeah, I think you're right about the economic part of it, right? We do need to have a system that really meets our labor force needs. We've had so much family-based immigration. It's very backlogged. It separates families. It doesn't give people who have other skills the opportunity to join here. And we know those folks do come in and work. So it's not really a problem of them not having skills and abilities here. It's a matter of there's a big mismatch. We've got a lot of open jobs in certain industries, and the immigrants we bring in don't always match that. And that's not necessarily a problem in that they find a way to work in this economy. They find a way to create new opportunities for themselves, but not filling those gaps, I think about particularly on the higher end of the skills and education and technology and doctors in particular. Like, why are we not bringing in people where we have real needs and real gaps in the labor force? And that's at all skill levels, right? We don't have a lot of childcare workers. Are there people abroad willing to come in and work as childcare workers, right? Looking at the economy realistically and saying, where are the gaps?
Are you telling me you have to cross an ocean to deal with an American child? Forget it. I mean,
there are people who willingly do that in our au pair program all the time because it still matters to them to come to the United States. But also, President Bush liked to say when he was in office that we can be a lawful society and a welcoming society at the same time. And so as a matter of policy, to me, what that says is we need to have robust immigration enforcement, but we also need to have really robust legal immigration. And you have to do both at the same time. What we've seen is if you just try to crack down on the border, you're just playing whack-a-mole. People will try to find ways to come here. And so legal pathways really matter and robust enforcement really matters. And it's a carrot and stick approach. How do you encourage people to go through the legal pathways? How do you encourage them to show up at ports of entry and still preserve America's still that beacon of freedom and opportunity. We really are. That's why people are still coming here. We have these kind of amazing fights here, really intense about what it is to be an American and who gets benefits and who doesn't, and how we make sure that we all have equal opportunity. And abroad, they're just looking at it going, that's a great place. I want to go there. Because we are still that destination for folks, making sure that our immigration system preserves that while still meeting our needs. It's not easy. There's a lot of pieces involved. I'm confident that there's enough good ideas out there that we can get there if there's political will.
Yeah, I can't remember who said it, but I always agreed with the statement that I'd rather be living in a country that people want to come to rather than a country that people want to leave from. So before I wrap things up, I just want to make a note that, of course, we'll, as always, provide links to any of the conversations we talked about in here, papers, insights, etc. So Laura, if you have anything you would like to highlight for our audience and people that listen to this, please send us to those and we'll make sure we add those in there as well. So Laura, thank you for joining us. I just have one last question. Was Doug always this fun to work with?
Always. If you work for him, you can't admit that, right? But Doug has always, my memories of AF are that it was always just a really fun workplace, and one where we worked on very, very serious topics, but we didn't take ourselves too seriously. And especially on a topic like immigration, it's really important that you remember that, there's so much outside of our control. Taking yourself too seriously is setting yourself up for failure because a lot of this is not going to be successful. It's a long game. And I think, that's something that I remember all the time when I'm working on this. And people ask me, how can you work on this topic? It's so dark and it's so hard and so volatile. I'm like, I love it. I love that it's controversial. And also, like, I can only control so much. So I go out and I do my best to spread facts and good ideas, and the rest of it is not up to me.
Excellent.
And I am glad she has such great memories. But what I remember of Laura is that she was always saying, Doug, line, you're close to the line, back off.
This is true. The lawyer in me only lets me have so much fun.
It seems since I've started here, we always at least have one lawyer on staff as a policy analyst. So it tracks. So thank you both, especially you, Laura, for joining us today. This topic of immigration is obviously not going anywhere, so I'm assuming we'll be talking about it on the podcast throughout the year and in any other mediums that we possibly can. It was great to have you. I hope we can have you back again because there's so much I think we didn't get to that I would love to hear about. I mean, we talk a lot about the economics of in the money around here, the fiscal aspects. So it was great to hear a different perspective on the other things that encompass this broad and important topic.
I'd be happy to come back.
Good. Thank you both.
Thanks.
Thank you.